So for me, the key was starting early, not to put an offer in, but just to get a feel for different areas in London. So over the summer in London, I went to visit quite a few parts just to see where I could actually picture myself living. Because, London varies so much in terms of commute, price, and just the general vibe of an area. And then I was also on Rightmove and Zoopla quite a lot, just saving places that I liked. And yeah, it was probably my most used app over the summer. But yeah, it helped me understand what my budget would realistically get me, what typical flats would look like, and just how quickly places disappear. And they do go fast. The flat I'm in now only came up like a week before I moved in. Another thing for anyone coming from outside London is don't rush into booking viewings until your results are confirmed. There's no point adding pressure or traveling back and forth if things aren't definite. But do have a look out for any virtual viewings because they are helpful just to get an initial sense of the property. Then, once my grades were actually confirmed, I moved quite quickly. I booked viewings straight away. I checked new listings daily. And when I found something that ticked my boxes and it actually was in budget, I just put an offer in. As you know, in the London market, you don't really have the time to overthink, especially when you've got 2 weeks before your first day. And then I'd also just like to add, if relocation does feel overwhelming, just speak to your firm. They're going to offer as much support as they can. For example, at Hogan Lovells, there's another apprentice who actually moved from Wales, and he was really struggling with the time pressure. And so the firm actually helped in rearranging some temporary accommodation in central London for about a month so they could just settle in. So yeah, you don't have to feel like you're organizing everything alone. There is support from your firm if you need it.
What sort of things did you find the most challenging about relocating? What sort of aspects? I know that you've all sort of touched on your individual things, but were there any specific things other than the tight time frame that you found quite challenging about relocation?
I think the tight time frame and the cost, I think, are the main things. And like ultimately, there's not a great deal that you can do about that apart from, try to plan ahead as best as possible. Um, and also one thing that I would say was also difficult is also just understanding London. And I think that's easier for some people compared to others, depending on how much you've actually been to London as you've been growing up. But I had no idea what was a safe area, what wasn't a safe area, what was close to the office, what wasn't. Even down to things like how much the tube was going to cost me, depending on what zone of London that I lived in. But I think for anyone who is about to embark on the relocation, in order to kind of like help those worries a little bit, some things that I kind of wish I knew, and if I was going to do it again, I would be a lot more mindful before I booked viewings in a day because it's so expensive to come down as I touched on before, and obviously you want to make the most out of that train ticket that you've paid for. So before you're ever going to do that, go on Google Street View, look around the area on Google Maps and see if it's a dodgy area before you go and book a viewing there and spend all that money coming down to come and visit it. I made the mistake of not doing that and ended up thinking that there was a lovely apartment in Tower Hamlets for me until I got off the train and realised I was in a very dodgy area.
I'd definitely echo the sentiment about researching the areas of London in which we're looking at moving to. I found Google Maps really helpful for this because I also wasn't well acquainted with London, and looking at where my office was in comparison to the different flats and areas I was looking at to live in was really helpful in deciding how long I wanted to commute every day. A bit of an odd one, but if you are commuting from a long distance, I would consider how you're going to bring all of your belongings down. Personally, my parents are still shipping me down all of my belongings 18 months later because I've been in this apprenticeship for almost 2 years now. So, one thing I would consider is sorting out what you have and what you're going to need as a necessity, and then what can potentially be brought down later, especially if you're taking the train, because I've had to carry multiple bags on the train over multiple trips, and it was not a fun experience.
Yeah, sure. So there is a working group of around, I want to say, just over 10 solicitor apprentices that City Sentry have put together. We had a meeting in December where the working group shared their concerns whilst they were relocating and allowed city sentry to respond to those concerns and, with the help of the working group, put in a plan in place to resolve those issues. So I know Cara's also was also part of that. So I think the clear message is that city sentry and current apprentices are working to resolve these issues that have been raised on the webinar. And perhaps if work still needs to be done when people on this webinar are apprentices, then it's perhaps something that you could get involved in. But yeah, rest assured that people are working to help, and that these issues hopefully won't be as strenuous forever.
Sure. So broadly speaking, it's good news for people in your situation who are moving to London, trying to find some rental accommodation. So I'm just going to run through a few of the key changes. So and these take effect from the 1st of May this year. So there's going to be a ban on what's been called rental bidding. And what this means is that landlords or their agents won't be able to let a property to someone for a rent higher than the advertised rent. So I'm not sure if anyone has experienced a scenario where you've found somewhere that you want to move into, you make an offer at the asking price, and then you're told that someone has outbid you. So that will no longer be possible because a ceiling will be set by the rent that will be advertised. So that should provide some more clarity as to the level of rent ultimately that the landlord is expecting. There's also or there will be a prohibition on landlords accepting any advance payments at the outset of the tenancy. So again, in all tenancies, and I'm sure it's the same for tenancies that you are looking at, you could find yourself in a scenario where you've made an offer, the landlord's willing to accept the rent, but then someone emerges who's suddenly somehow able to pay 3 months rent up front, and then the landlord says, well, I'm going to go with them because I can get that money of security. So that will be banned. So you can pay the first month's rent up front, which obviously you naturally would do anyway. But that removes another potentially unfair, divisive factor of renting. And then this leads us on to the most fundamental change in that they're going to get rid of fixed term tenancies. So I imagine that most of you have been looking at or offered perhaps tenancies for a year with perhaps a right to break at 6 months, but all tenancies will become rolling tenancies on a monthly basis in most cases. So this is really helpful because I think some of you were saying that you might move into accommodation, realize it's not your forever home, let's just say, and under the old regime, you would be you tied in there to a fixed period of time. But under this new regime, as a tenant, you'll actually be able to give 2 months' notice to terminate your tenancy at any time. So if you do move somewhere, and often I know what I found was that once you've moved to London, logistically, it's a lot easier to get an understanding of the places and also just do more viewings because you're actually physically there. So this is really helpful because you won't be tied into long-term tenancies, and you'll have a lot more flexibility to move around. And then I suppose the other two key features are so at the moment, if your tenancy comes to an end, the landlord will ultimately say, okay, I'm going to increase the rent. And if you say no, 9 times out of 10, there'll be someone else who can afford to pay the higher rent. So they'll serve a notice to evict you. And so this is what's called a no fault eviction. So they're going, so the landlord won't be able to terminate a tenancy under that same basis. That they'll be able to terminate a tenancy if you don't pay the rent and the usual things that you would expect, but it takes away a really big negotiating chip that the landlord had to increase the rent. And then that leads us on to the final big change, which is that landlords will only be able to increase the rent once a year. And in order to do so, they can't do anything in the first year whilst you're living there. And if they want to increase the rent, they've got to give you at least 2 months' notice of what they want to increase it to. And as a tenant, you'll be able to challenge that. So if you think this is ridiculous, this isn't market rate, you can actually challenge that. You can go to a tribunal, and the tribunal will determine whether the rent should be what the landlord's proposing, or if lower, the market rent. So in essence, it's a huge rebalance of the power dynamic, which is really good news for you guys, because it's rebalancing it away from the landlord in favor of the tenants. So I think it's going to be really helpful. Take at least, not all, but at least some of the pressure off, because you won't be committing yourselves to potentially, 1 year plus contracts. You'll have the flexibility to move around if actually that's what you decide to do.
Thanks for that, Steve. That's really useful. And myself wanting to relocate, that's really reassuring to hear that, as you say, we've got a rebalance of power, which is really, really reassuring and makes me feel a lot more confident going forward. Could I ask that you also remind us of some of the practices that were already prohibited following the introduction of the Tenant Fees Act?
Yeah, sure. So I remember when I was renting, agents could just get away with charging, crazy, insane fees for what is essentially a light bit of administration. So the Tenant Fees Act fortunately put a stop to a lot of those practices. So some of the protections that came in and will continue to apply, if your landlord asks you to pay a holding deposit, so let's just say you found a property that you want to move into, but you haven't signed the tenancy agreement yet, but you want to kind of show your interest, then that's limited to being an amount equivalent to 1 week's rent, and that's refundable if the letting ultimately doesn't go ahead. Any rent deposit that you have to pay for most tenancies, it's limited to an amount that's equivalent to 5 weeks' rent. So you used to have tenants rent deposits of 3 months' rent, so, really ridiculous amounts that most normal people would struggle to get together. And then, as mentioned, they banned a lot of what we'll call agency fees. So the agents used to charge for checking your references and doing a checkout and checkout cleaning, and would they actually do anything? Debatable, and they'd all be about £50 plus VAT for each one, and they'd all rack up. And then certain other fees. So if you want to assign your lease to someone else, that's now capped. So that's £50. So there are existing protections which, coupled with the new protections coming in, will create a far fairer landscape for renters.